Now we'll look at another game against Sergei Karyakin, also from the Melody Amber tournament a year later, I believe, in 2009. This was a rapid game, and I was telling Magnus on one of our breaks that I play the black side of the opening in question here, the semi-Slav, and this game made me not ever want to touch this line again, this particular variation. Maybe you can show us why things were unpleasant for black.
Yeah, so we have a bit of background information again. At this point, it was not public, but I started working with Gary Kasparov, and he had recommended this particular line, which was not considered to be very critical, let's say. So the line with going e4 here. e5, I think I had it, if I'm not mistaken, I had it earlier in the year against Topalov. Maybe that was with the move order of g6 and then bishop g7, e4, and dc, and then e5. I'm not 100% sure of that. We should check it, but basically this was what happened in the game was the position that I was trying to get. Let's say e5 and then queen e7, and in other lines you're making some waiting moves before going for e4 e5. So at least here you got everything without wasting any time. The position is still very unclear, but it's a position where white can at least fight for the advantage. But this line was not considered to be critical at all, exactly because of e5, knight b6, bishop g4. But Gary had told me that this line was not so simple. It was something that he had been considering for a long time. But also we didn't consider this line that great for white, seeing as I actually played it in a rapid game, not a classical game. And to my surprise, well, it did dissuade you from playing this line as black, and it also became surprisingly popular in classical chess. A lot of people were trying to get this same thing as white. So I remember the basic idea he was telling me about was here, after these moves, which are not forced but all very logical. It's clear that white is probably gonna get the pawn structure with dc6 and bc6, and the plan which he showed me was the plan to get the knight to e3 and then the rook to c5. That was the key that would happen later on. And it really appealed to me from an harmonic point of view.
For sure. That seems like a direct hit as far as him judging the type of position you'd like to play.
For sure. So this was in 2009. I'd already become a little more positional in my style, though I would say I still played fairly direct chess. So there are a lot of options for him here. One of the best ones is certainly not taking on d5. Here you could see the difference. These pawns actually don't really matter. What matters is the open c file, the active bishop compared to his passive one, and a pawn that's going to fall pretty soon. So there are other ways to play for him, but this is all pretty logical, and I don't think he spent too much time on this. So bishop f6 and knight d1. This is what I wanted to get. There are a number of sort of concrete ways to defend here for black. One that I wanted to show was rook c8, rook c5 is the idea. if I go knight e3, immediately there may be. I think he would still go something like king f8 though, but maybe he could also prevent it more radically by going c5 here. And
is bishop g5 an idea? Does he want to trade bishop for knight?
No, I don't think he does. At least not concretely in this line. Let's say you could get king f8 and f6, then I would still be a bit skeptical. But it could be a good idea, especially if you could get the king to e6. But right here, e5 is a problem. And let's say you take it, then knight d7, rook c7, then I think quick f4 is giving white some initiative. Let's say I do go rook c5. There is bishop e7, knight e5, rook e5, then bishop e4. Amazingly, actually traps the rook. Knight d7 coming next. So I go rook a5, there's rook c7. Now I can grab the pawn, but there's c5, and black has counterplay. Knight e3, king f8. If knight d5, there's bishop d6 takes, and bishop e5.
And the key difference why rook takes e5 is possible there is you have the check.
Exactly, a check on e8, but still losing the e5 pawn, as you can see, is not necessarily a disaster. As long as the rook is getting trapped, and also he has possibilities of a blockade here. So really, I think after rook c8, there was nothing too bad for him. Here he still has possibilities, but they're probably connected with bishop e7. Once again, giving up that pawn. Rook e5 and c5 is the idea once again, which is pretty amazing. Rook c5, rook d1 wins, and knight e3. There's rook d4 followed by bishop d6. So kudos to the guys working on these lines for pointing this out.
Yes, Christoph and Peter.
Yeah, it's really cool. But it just shows that you have to play concretely, because positionally speaking, it's getting pretty difficult to hold the black position. There are 3 weaknesses, and that's usually a bit too much. And Karyakin must have been kicking himself for playing another opposite color bishop ending against me. So we got h5, knight e3. Now it's all sort of flowing. King e2, bishop g7, preparing f6 and bishop h6, and knight c2. And now everything cannot be held. Let's say he goes f6, I go knight b4, king d7, rook a5, knight c8, bishop a4, king c7, I take on c6, take everything, rook a6. It is really in a lot of trouble. If he goes king d7, I'm simply gonna go b4 or a4 first, advancing these pawns and keeping him completely passive. If he goes king c7, I do the same, and if king b7, the rook will enter, and his bishop will be very short of squares if it intends to defend the pawn on f6.
So despite material being nominally equal in this line,
yeah,
and 2 minors versus rook, he's just so passive.
He's just so passive, exactly. Which is a really cool line.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that I looked at during the game, that his pieces are so bad that I can just go for this.
Another example how you can't be binary with your judgments. You got to be willing to do something that's maybe non-standard, like going for a position with rook against 2 minor pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. So he goes for bishop h6. as far as I can remember, his point is that I think he wants knight c4 here in order to activate the knight in case I take the pawn. I could be wrong, but I feel like that's his idea. In case I take it, he goes rook d2 and he's got knight e5 and he's suddenly got a lot of activity here. c5, c4 might be an issue, for instance. So otherwise, I don't see why I wouldn't take. So I went rook a5 instead going for a7, but this pawn looked very, very juicy for sure. Anyway, rook a5. It's important to note that rook d2 does invade, but it doesn't actually do very much since I can just drop the king back. Now without the e5 squared, knight c4 is not quite as attractive. And also I get a pawn with check there, and he goes rook d7 and rook a5. Here at the very least, the king is worse on e1, so we would have better chances here. But it will still be pretty stat.
And unfortunately, black's king blocks bishop d2 in that line.
Yeah, that's true. And also, if he goes knight c8, protecting a7, then I think his knight is so passive that I will just take the pawn and then probably go to c5 and push e5. So he goes rook d7. Now I take on e5. I think in this case, after king f6, I would just go rook c5. And with the rook on d6, he would have had knight d7. But here, knight d7, I get this pawn with check, and that should be pretty good.
Right.
So he goes king d6, rook a5. I cannot protect the pawn, but now my pawns are advancing. Everything is coming naturally. Knight b4. Rook c7 loses to a simple tactic. And yeah, there are no other ways of protecting c7, so he just has to go in full grovel mode. So I think at this point, he actually went bishop c1 first. Rook f3, rook c7, which is more clever. Which is rather more clever, actually. Rook c5, rook c2, and king e4, king g7. And I can remember at this point that I was a bit impatient. Like, I felt that I'd done everything right, and I should be completely winning. And it turned out that it wasn't so easy. That there was no immediate win, which made me a bit upset. I remember I'd hoped for knight e7 here, that he would do that instead, in which case I was just intending to take. If he takes on c2, I take on g6 for a straightforward opposite color bishop win, because these pawns are still on the board. There are plenty of pawns, and if he takes with the rook, then I go f5, and this should be pretty easy. But he went king g7 instead. I remember I thought for a while, and I just ended up playing this so ridiculous move, which was bishop takes f7, which I cannot really explain. There were a number of ways to play. For instance, there's knight d8. Just exchanging the rooks doesn't really matter that much, since here he needs to go bishop e7 to prevent bishop b3. Doesn't really matter too much to exchange rooks as long as we got a pair of knights on the board. And here you see knight e4, knight g5, or knight d6 if he moves the knight as a knight d8.
Yeah,
Should be plain sailing.
And you still seem kind of upset about that inaccuracy
Yeah,
many years later.
Yeah, which is why whenever this game is brought up, I'm like, ugh. And
Magnus said, we'll go through this one kind of fast.
Yeah,
before we went.
even during the game, I was just kicking myself. So I went for this, and I sort of realized that after I played it, even though I thought for a while that he could just hold with Rook F7, Knight E7, Rook C7 first, Rook A7, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Could probably go Rook F5 even, but the point is that if he just does this, I don't know, this actually does look like a fortress. I'm not getting F5 and...
Yeah, hard to make use of the 4 versus 2.
Fortunately, he played King F8, F7 pretty quickly. I don't know, I can just count myself lucky there.
Mm-hmm.
Knight D8, and now Rook C3 is the big point. Rook D3 check, F5.
So that move is critical.
Yeah, that was a huge relief. As long as I get these 2 connected passers, then that's it. But
not allowing any semblance of a blockade.
No. Here, the thing is that he lacks targets for his pieces, and this is just gonna win in the long run. And I think the way that I won was a bit computerish in the sense that I went for the A4 pawn and didn't just try to promote the pawns cleanly, but there was no problem whatsoever. It's with 3 passed pawns and he has none, then even though they are semi-blocked, doesn't actually matter.
Yep.
Yeah, so there you go. E7, Rook D8 next. But
right.
Still,
So bishop takes F7 aside. The play leading up to that point.
Yeah, the play leading up to that was sort of exactly what I'd been looking at with Gary, like what you would dream of getting. So that was really pleasant. But
that's got to be a huge edge preparation wise when you get a position. I've had this scenario a few times in games where I happen to have studied a late middle game position in great detail, and I knew it was quite comfortable for me, and the plans were straightforward. It's just so nice to be able to do what you did, target the weaknesses, maneuver.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You got yourself a position where you know what the plans are, and you know that black does have some concrete solutions, but you do know that passive play is not going to do black any good. And so you're sort of putting the onus on black for finding a good active plan over the board, which practice has shown is not easy even for the best players. Yeah,
I thought it was instructive how you switched from attacking, C pawn to E pawn to A pawn.
They're also weak,
Yeah, right. Whereas the double pawns for white, H pawn, hard for black to ever attack those.
Yeah, the problem is that his bishop is worse than mine, and
knight
his
also
knight
pretty
is
bad.
also worse. So if those, let's say you transform the knight to F4, then you got yourself a completely different ballgame. So
yeah, and one final point I wanted to touch on is you mentioned something instructive. We talk a lot about what to do from the offensive side. Naturally, we're looking at a lot of techniques to win games. But we don't want to forget about defense, too. And you were mentioning how, if you were in Karyakin's shoes maybe, and he probably was in the game, looking for concrete resources when you sense the game is drifting strategically. Try to work yourself out if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not really his style. That's the thing. Like, he much prefers to try and hold everything. As long as possible, he just wants to hold. Even if there are active possibilities, there are attempts to break out that don't look hopeless. If he feels that he can hold, he will try and hold instead. And you could see in this particular case, that was not the best approach. Because you simply cannot hold the position by playing passively. It's too compromised already. So I think the best defenders, even though he's a very good defender, the very best defenders, they can switch between these two mindsets at an even better rate.
Okay, great insight and possible line for those of you who are D4 players out there against the Semi-Slav and the Moscow variation.
Yeah, it should be noted that what people are doing. Yeah, people are playing different lines now, but yeah, it's not a bad line at all.
Yeah, so you can get a little opening work in, even though this is an endgame and strategy course.
Yeah, it's all connected, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Now we have an example of a pure opposite color bishop ending. There's rooks on the board as we see the position here, but they will be coming off. So this was a game you played against Nakamura at the Tall Memorial in 2011.
Yeah, it was in the last round. I guess I sort of needed a win with black in the last round. I think I'd drawn Tomaszewski the day before. In a game I had some advantage, which was pretty disappointing. So anyway, we got this position. He played the move knight f3, which surprised me a lot because I thought g5 just wins a pawn. After thinking for a while, I concluded that probably does indeed just win a pawn. And as the further course of the game shows, he doesn't have a whole lot of compensation. And here I would say that I'm not really sure that knight f3 is a great decision. I remember during the game that I was sort of half worried about these positions, whether something like h3 would give him counterplay. But I think realistically, not really. I can go h5, for instance. If he takes rook h1. There's if I want, there's queen f5. I had some vague idea that I rather wanted to have a bishop on, let's say, on f3 than a knight in these queenless positions. But to me now, looking back, it seems exactly that, a bit vague. But I did have a very concrete idea in mind by going for knight f3 and trading down to an opposite colored bishop ending. Mm-hmm. So he went rook d7, which is pretty logical. I felt that if he plays very passively, my bishop is so strong that I'm controlling the d1 square for the rook that I can eventually go f6, e5, bring my king around, and eventually I should be able to break him down.
Some sort of f4 break later.
Yeah, I mean, there are ideas like I can attack f2 at some point. I can maybe attack h2 also. It felt like it should be winning. Anyway, he goes for this, rook d5, and this was my big idea.
Mm-hmm. So he has to trade.
What I've been counting on. Yeah, he has to trade. If he takes this one, there's rook e8 and rook d1. You gotta be careful with that weakened back rank. And bishop e3 and rook e4. I think bishop e3 was pretty forced because I was threatening rook e2. And so what I'd seen from afar is what happened in the game rook e4, that I could play rook e1. I think also bishop e2 would have been pretty strong here. But this is what I was aiming for. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, I was pretty sure that he was winning. Mm-hmm. That he would have to give up the f pawn, but then me having two passed pawns and possibly trading one passed pawn for the h pawn, and there being pawns on both sides. That this would just be would be a win for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume that f4 was absolutely forced. It's quite instructive to see what could have happened if he just waits passively. Let's say if he goes bishop d2, just waiting. He's got bishop f6 to prevent king c2 and an immediate win. But I got b5, a5. He waits. a4. And now I got a c3 square for the king. Bishop c4 is coming.
That's an interesting nuance.
And I think if he goes a3 instead, preventing the pawn from getting to a3, I'm gonna go b4. I'm gonna go king c4 next. d3 is gonna come, and I'm gonna invade on b3.
Mm-hmm.
Since that square has now been weakened by a3, and b2 is a target. So this is a bit similar to those positions that we were talking about earlier with the pawn push to b7, that the variations are easy to calculate because there is so little counterplay.
Right.
Which I think, as in the other examples, is what attracted me to these particular endings. Having said that, I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing this way, as we were talking about earlier. You do look pretty stupid if it fails. Like, you just traded all your pieces with a nice extra pawn to get to this opposite color bishop endings. Like, why?
Yeah.
So he does go for f4, which is what I'd expected, and what I had evaluated is that this position would be winning for me. Bishop f2 is important, forces me to play d3 and decrease the activity of my own bishop. I would have loved to see king f2, king g7, king going to e5 and e4, and then I can start moving the bishop around.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes bishop f2, I go d3, bishop e1 back, and now he's activated his king. And it's looking a bit difficult for me to win.
Yeah.
I think looking from afar, I had just assumed that I would go king f5, and I thought if I'm allowed king f5, I'm winning. King g4, I'm winning, and if h3, bishop f1, that should be winning.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out to be true, but once again, in another case, it may not. So it's quite instructive to see what would happen if he doesn't play h3. Let's say he just waits. I can always play f2 if I want, trading that pawn for the h pawn, but I want to make some preparatory moves first. Yeah, I guess also a3, for instance, b5 comes down to the same thing. It should be noted that whenever he wants to fix the pawn structure with b4, that means that a3 is a weakness, as we will see later in the game.
Right.
But let's just say he goes bishop e3. Bishop f4, the point of that is trying to stop f2 because he will have g4 later on. But he cannot really prevent that. So let's say bishop to e3. F2. I'm creating a second passer pretty soon. Now I'm going f4.
Right.
That's the idea. Where, however it takes, I'm going h4, and that outside pass pawn is going to be too much for him to deal with. yeah, also bishop f4.
And these are the sort of schemes that you're envisioning when you made the decision to trade rooks, kind of these general pictures of where the pawn breaks are going to happen. Again, the moves leading up to them, not so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that he cannot actually do anything, so I'm gonna get my king into the game. And what I had seen was exactly this king f5, that he would have to make a very difficult decision there, whether to play h3 or not. And I believe intuitively that I would be winning regardless.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, what can I say? It worked out pretty well in the game. But
right.
Looking back, I'm feeling like, woo, how could I be so confident? Why didn't I go for something else? But I don't know. I guess it was just one of these cases, like I wanted to play something where I was pretty sure that I was winning and there was absolutely no counterplay.
Uh-huh.
But obviously in this case, you risk running into fortresses. So let's see what happened in the game. He goes h3, which is very logical. I go h5 first, preparing bishop f1. And here is another option. He could go h4, similar to what we've seen before. But now I've got, once again, a fairly simple winning plan. I'm gonna provoke a3. I'm gonna go back. We continue to wait. I'm gonna put the bishop on e4, which can never be captured because one of the pawns will run on queen. And with the pawn weakness on a3, I'm running to the queen side.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, it takes a lot of time, but it's all pretty straightforward.
Yep.
Trading one more pawn to open up the pathway to the queen side and promoting the pawn.
Yeah.
And there's just way too much for him to have to worry about here.
So the additional pawn cluster can be really important for black in winning this ending.
Oh yeah, for sure. Without these pawns on the queen side, it would have been a dead draw.
Mm-hmm.
But with so many pawns and pawns on both sides, I did have the feeling that it was going to be winning.
Right.
So I think what he did, bishop e1, is the most stubborn. And I think if he takes an f3, that's going to be pretty similar to what we saw before, with the king going to g4, f5, and then f4 happening, creating this pass pawn. So he takes on d3, which is very logical. He keeps all the pawns on the same side. Now I got my only extra pawns are on the f or h files, which makes it pretty difficult, theoretically speaking, to win.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that it's still possible. b5, trying to improve my pawns here a bit on the queen side. Once again, I'm not worried about b3. I'm gonna provoke a3 or b3 later on. b4, as we can see, what happened in the game does not do him any good, and also a3 will open up a pathway for the king. He goes for a bunch of waiting moves. He goes b3, and I would say that a3 would be quite similar. And f4. As we talked about before, that's always the idea. If he takes him with the bishop, that loses immediately. h4, bishop moves away, h3, we got f2, or I got h2. Doesn't matter, both can be played immediately and both win. So he goes gf, only choice, h4. He's got to give up that pawn. And he's got to blockade. I cannot win the game on the king side only.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm gonna eventually create a pathway for the king to the queen side. As we saw before, if he'd played a3 earlier on, there would have been a path via b3, but he's trying to prevent that by playing b3 himself. So h3, pushing that pawn as far as possible. And what happens here is that I'm gonna open up the pathway. Here I could have just taken.
Oh yeah.
Which I did see. There are too many pass pawns. But you know what? I had seen another way to win, which I thought was simpler and also more instructive, because my whole plan was based on forcing his pawns to the dark squares and opening up that pathway for the king. So I just did it very simple. I played bishop e4, can never be taken, obviously. a3, bishop a2, king f1, f2, bishop e1, a3, bishop a2, b4, bishop f7, and he resigned. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen here is actually fairly simple. With the pawns on d3 and f3, the dream square for the bishop was e4. Mm-hmm. Can never be taken by the king and protects both pawns. So with h3 and f3, naturally the dream square is going to be g4. That's where it's heading. So let's say he just waits. The bishop is heading to g4. He can never stop the king because he has to worry about these pawns. So he just needs to continue waiting. I'm gonna take the a pawn. It's worth mentioning, let's say if I gave him a couple of moves here. Let's say if I go king b3, and it goes bishop a5, king a4 is very nice.
Yeah. Separated pawns.
Separated pawns are one of them are gonna queen on the next move. And if he does go bishop d6, then king a4 is gonna come. That will be a third pass pawn, and that's gonna be an easy win.
Right. So it seems like your judgment was correct in this one.
It was correct, but it's one of those don't try this at home cases.
Or if you try it, you better be certain about it, or as close to certain as you can be in a game.
Exactly. Like, the line between genius and fool is pretty thin in such cases. And really, there's nothing in between.
But also, it seems like a hallmark of exceptionally strong players is they're willing to test that mark and see where it falls. And if they do make a fool of themselves, that's part of the process.
It is. Like, I have run into fortresses. As I said, it's never pleasant. A bit embarrassing, but it does happen, and it could have happened in this game, but it didn't. And you could say that the whole approach was vindicated from the first time. I didn't have to make difficult decisions for the rest of the game because of this decision. But once again, I'm not really sure about it. It does feel like, intuitively, it does feel a tad lazy to me to go for this. On one hand, it's not lazy at all because you're making a non-obvious decision, but on the other hand, I'm making this decision because I don't want to make any difficult calculations later on, and I don't want to run any risk.
Do you think Rook D7 was the decisive mistake? Is White able to defend this ending at all, or?
Look, I'm used to looking at this from a practical point of view. I think from a practical point of view, there is virtually no chance of saving this. So I would say if we're calling Rook D7 a decisive mistake, I guess technically the position goes from very bad to it can be proven that it's lost. So in that sense it does, but I would not criticize Rook D7. It forces me to go for what I went for in the game, and that wasn't so simple.
Got it. Okay. Well, great explanation there, and especially helpful to hear the considerations when trading into an opposite color bishop endgame like that. What sort of patterns you have in mind, where the king's going to enter, the pawn breaks.
Yeah, and I think the key here is that when this happens, when your opponent finds the resource of playing f4, or you reach this position in your calculations, don't panic and think that this is a clear-cut fortress, because even though there is no way to forcibly queen one of these pawns in the short term, then I would say, because there are pawns on both sides, infiltration possibilities for the king on both sides, then very often there's going to be a way to make progress still.
Okay, perfect. And not all opposite color bishop endings are drawn.
For sure not. Especially not with the rook on the board, but also with bishops. Only bishops.
Okay, next we're going to take a look at a 2007 encounter Magnus had against Levon Aronian. And this game has some crossover value, some great strategic themes, but also a very instructive endgame as well.
I guess so. This was the sort of the candidates matches that we had in 2017 that I actually qualified for in December 2015. So it was a long way. There was a long wait there. And I was the last seed based on the ratings that we had, the different participants had when we qualified for the candidates, which meant that I played the highest seed, who was Aronian, which was a bit strange. Anyway, I lost the first game as white. I drew the second game as black in a banker, actually. Just no clue what to do in the openings. I was changing openings every time as both black and white, since just thought that Aronian was much better there, and
trying to make something stick.
So here, this time the opening had been pretty successful. He had made one poor move earlier on, and at this point, at least superficially, it looks pretty nice. I've got a nice pawn center and some possibilities of an attack, and it looks all pretty harmonious. So he goes knight c6 here. This is all pretty forced. If he takes some g5, I just go hg and good luck.
Attack probably plays itself down the h file.
Yeah, so he goes cd. He had relied on this idea. I sort of have to exchange in order not to lose a pawn. And d5, knight a5. At first glance, this looks incredibly dumb, what black has done. He's given himself a double pawn. It's given me a pass pawn. and a potentially juicy square on f5 for the knight. He does have some advantages though, in that he's got the majority. He's got a potentially very nice blockading square for the knight on d6, and possibilities of using the c file. So I don't think it is as obvious as it may seem at first glance. So my next move is pretty simple. h5, preparing knight h4, knight c4, knight h4, knight d6. And here I could have gone rook to c1, which was probably a pretty good option. Then in case of rook c1, knight e4, I got rook c7, and it's not really breaking out here. So this is all very, very good for white. Instead, I decided to go h6, thinking that I had time to hem in the king. I probably was, I don't know if I was worried about king g7. Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense though, because I go rook c6. In case of rook c8, I go rook d1. This, for instance, should be very, very strong. Not, well, even this.
Yep.
Or I guess more precisely rook e1, in order not to get attacked from c3. So that may have been a good option. For me, I just thought I'm going to restrict his king, get the pawn to h6. It all looks very good. He goes rook c3, and I remember that to me, the next move was obvious, rook c1. I barely even calculated knight e4. I just thought I'm going to take on c3 and go d6. It should be noted that he may have, he should maybe have played more carefully by playing rook g8. Then there are plans like going g4, rook c4, knight f5, knight f5, gf, and then I can potentially use the g file to get rook to g7, but it's not completely clear. Anyway, here I guess his best chance was definitely to take on e4 here. I'll take, and I go d6, and you know he can get the knight back.
And that's interesting. You said you barely calculated this.
I barely calculated, and I think, practically speaking, this would have been his best choice.
And is that because you just understand that the quality of your pawns and the activity?
Yeah, exactly. I just felt that doesn't matter if I lose the e-pawn. The fact that I get to push the pawn, get the knight to f5 is just way more important. And I think even here, something like this, king goes to e3. He's very, very passive once he starts pushing his pawns. He loses the foothold for the knight on c5. So even this would have been very promising. But here you can imagine a scenario where black gets out, at the very least. But he goes rook fc8, which is a lot more logical. He's just trying to control the c file and give him time to get the king back into the play. He will have no worries at all. But I had seen this plan, which is knight f5. So everything is sort of following the same plan here. This could all not have been possible without the pawn on h6. I'm just banking everything on that I can beat him here before he gets his forces into play. And actually that line was this line is winning, and it is all pretty forced. So what he does have to play, he has to go rook king g8, and I think, as far as I can remember, judging by his body language, he didn't really feel like he was lost here still. And it's not obvious at first sight. Once again, given time, let's say you put the king on d6, black is probably better. At least if you get rook c4. Well, that move rook c4 sort of gives a hint to what my next one is, which is rook to e4. And the pawn on h6 means that I can combine mating threats with ideas of winning the h7 pawn or queening the d pawn. He goes king f8. No sense in hiding the king the other way. Let's say rook d3, rook g4, king h8, rook c4 wins. If he goes rook c5 instead, I'm just going to push the pawn. And the same thing is gonna happen.
Yeah. That's cool how the h6 pawn has two-way threats, the back rank threats, but of course invading on g7 as well, supporting that.
Yeah. And it should be noted in this line also rook g7, if he takes, he has to go king g8 to prevent rook h8 followed by h7. If he goes back to f8, there is rook g4 and king h8, rook f7, and that's it. So he tries to be a bit more solid. He thinks that the d pawn is anyway under check here. No worries. But it all works out for me. I managed to activate my forces in time. So I take the pawn. He has to go to h8, king f8. There's still rook g4. I go d6, and I start advancing the king. And even if he were to push his pawns here, a5, king d5. Let's say I'm being very cooperative here. Just going king c6, b2. Even this, I think, is gonna be a fairly simple win. Just gobble up f7, take f6 later on. Should be a win. But obviously, there are a number of ways to win much easier, like rook g4, and that's the end of the game.
To me, this really illustrates how quality of your pawns trumps quantity. I mean, it's equal pawns, but black's just busted if your king starts invading like that.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that his king is stuck on h8, it may look like my rook is a bit passive on g7, but the fact that it hems in the black king, and I actually have a path for the king myself, just makes all the difference in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened is he needed to take on d6. He goes for the a pawn, but it doesn't matter. Now I get g5, f6,
another pass pawn,
and the king is just moving in. That's gonna be the end. For instance, if he takes an a2, I can try rook d2. Doesn't matter one bit. For instance, I can just go rook e7, b3, f7, and yeah, rook e8 is next. Rook d6, I just take, and rook e8 after rook d8. So that's easy.
Yeah.
I guess I should probably show another game from that particular match against Aronian, the other one that I won in classical, because it was some of the same themes of breakthrough.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was so cool to see how your pawns, having established them pretty early on the 5th and especially the 6th rank with your H-pawn, made all the difference here. A couple things come to mind for me. So in one of the lines you showed where if black's rook are on c4, trying to stop rook e4, rook g4, do you think black could hold there if that were the case, if he had not played rook c3?
You mean...
Yeah, maybe this in anticipation of that same line happening?
Yeah. I wouldn't rule it out, to be fair. Because rook c3 is a bit strange if you're not intending to go knight e4, that tactical point after rook c1. So
it seems like a bit of an aimless square, yeah.
Yeah, it does. So yeah, maybe you could have tried this.
Yeah, perhaps more tenacious.
I'm sort of thinking like maybe even something very slow, like f3, then ring the king, then knight f5 might be strong.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure. If I'm making that argument, then I probably could have done that in the game as well. So let's say goes, but it looks a bit slow.
Since I have the benefit of hindsight, I'm trying to make it harder for you to achieve knight f5.
Yeah. As you should.
And the other thing related to that, what do you think about black playing h6 prior to you playing h6?
That's an interesting question. Probably it would have been a very good idea, but he doesn't have time. Because he needs to get the knight to d6.
Okay, so the immediacy of knight h4 is a threat.
Yeah. It just feels like, let's say you go h6, that once this knight lands, that's going to be very, very bad news.
It basically forces king h7.
Yeah, we can even start playing moves like a4 here, preventing counterplay. And I feel like the best case scenario is that you get knight d6 at some point, and you just get a much worse version of what you have in the game. Right. I guess also d6 looks very, very strong. Rook d8, just rook d1 if rook d7. We can still go, let's say a4, rook d8 and rook d3, and this pawn is never hanging. So
okay.
Maybe there was something better there, but anyway, yeah. So that's the basic answer. But I just didn't give him time to play h6.
Okay. Cool. Great illustration of far advanced pawns, the effect that they can have, and also principle of two weaknesses style, switching targets. Times.
For sure. I think at this time I was 16. I was probably making all of this up on the go, but it worked out pretty well. And
that was still your direct phase
of
your chess career.
For sure. But I think this whole knight f5 idea, it's all about non-standard thinking, in the sense like you just want to get rid of that blockader, and you just have to remove the mental block that it's so ugly to get the pawn to f5 when you have this nice pawn on e4, preventing supporting d5. And I, as you said, the directness, but I would also say the single-mindedness of play that I often showed in those days. It paid off there.
Yeah. Great. And we'll dig up that other game against Aronian. Sounds interesting. All right, now we're going to take a look at the game Magnus just referenced from that mini match with Aronian in the Candidates Tournament 2007.
Yeah. So keep in mind in the meantime. So what I showed was game 3. In the meantime, he's beaten me pretty easily with white in game 4. So game 5 was my last chance as white. So I really needed to take this one. Basically, I was winning from the opening. He messed up pretty bad there. Then played a little too conservatively, and we got into an ending. So what I was thinking at this particular point is there are a lot of things going for me here. I got this nice extra pawn on f6. The knight looks pretty good.
He's got a tall pawn on e6.
Well, the bishop is okay. This looks to me like bad bishop protecting good pawns, to be fair. Mm-hmm. So basically I just need to find a way to win the game. But he does have some counterplay. He does have these this pawn on c4 that can be very, very, very dangerous. So he's not without chances. Let's say after what he does, rook to a1, I took king h2, rook a3. Basically, playing passively here for him is pretty hopeless. So he just goes for counterplay. And a crucial point is that something like knight g6 is not very good. He takes it, take on e6, take c3. Doesn't matter rook e7 or rook d6. He's probably making a draw here. So this is completely the wrong path. And after what happened in the game, rook b8, also rook f8 is pretty wrong. Take king g8, take on g6, rook d3, and I'm not better.
Yeah.
Just take my word, I'm not better.
Yep.
Gonna have 4 pawns against 2, doesn't matter. These
are faster.
These are simply faster. So I actually need something special to win, which is f4. And the breakthrough in the previous game reminded me of this one. That's what I wanted to show it, and that they actually came in consecutive important white games was pretty cool. So he takes on c3, no other choice there. Rook f8, h5, and rook f8. I've given up 2 pawns. I'm now a pawn down, but I retain my knight and the attacking chances. f5 is coming next, and it cannot be prevented. Rook a3, f5 takes, check, and now comes the important point, king g3. All is completely forced, and it's the only way to win. And the point is c3. I go king f4. If he moves the rook, he moves the bishop. He either has to give up d7 or g6. So let's say he moves the bishop away to e4. I give a check. King e8 or king g8, doesn't really matter. Here I can win with knight d7.
The pawn runs through.
Yeah, exactly. Knight d7. And if he goes for queen, that's a pretty nice.
Oh yeah,
pretty nice checkmate.
Yeah.
King g8, rook g7, or king e8. And knight.
Yeah, that's great. Full coordination, rook, knight, pawn.
Yeah. And this is what I had to see from afar that I had to see this king g3 move that king f4 was going to work. So I thought that was kind of cool as well. But it once again showcases my ability in those days to be very, very direct. Just
if I saw that idea, I don't think I could resist that either.
No. Very much a no-nonsense approach. So instead he went rook d8, moved the bishop. I don't even want to go and win the exchange yet. I go g3, just save that pawn, c3, king e8, f7, or rook e7 is mate, so it takes. And now c2, I would win very easily. Bishop d3, I can just go king e5, king e6, and I'm going to mate him first before he makes a queen. So.
Let black queen again.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was sort of a simpler example, seeing that I started material up and everything, but I think this whole idea with both to play f4 and then h5, it's something that it's easy to miss.
Yeah.
And it shows the power of thinking a little bit outside the box, and also looking at the direct lines. Like once you realize that the whole plan of going for knight f7 is wrong, then you have to find something else.
Yeah, so keeping the knight on board was critical for you.
Keeping the knight on board is critical, and as you could see, it was absolutely dominating the position. The bishop was protecting all the key squares, but once the king got into play, it could no longer. So,
yeah. Nice. Great addendum to that other game with Aronian in the 2007 candidates.
Yeah, good memories, although for clarity's sake, it should be mentioned that Aronian did go on to win much entirely. So.